Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today I wanted to make this video as part of a mini-series that I believe I'm going to be doing here entitled Pokemon University. This stems from a conversation I had with a friend of mine on Discord about efficiently EVing certain Pokemon, and they're newer to the game, well, the competitive side of the game, and I found that it's not a very common topic on YouTube to cover the in and outs of optimizing your EV spreads. So I figured I would start off with this topic in this video here, as Pokemon spreads and EVs are one of my favorite things to do in the game with calculations, and a lot of people assume that you just run the calculations and that's going to be your best bet for EVs when there's a whole lot more factors that go in behind the scenes, as I'll cover here. So we'll just start off with a basic overview of what EV points are. Essentially, you have each Pokemon has 510 EV point available to them, but only 580 of those are usable and affect stats because of the way that it's coded and such. The most EV points that you can put into a single stat is 252. That's very common. That is pretty much the most basic and most used EV spread that you'll see on Pokemon is 252, 252, 4. When EVing a Pokemon to gain one stat point for the first time, it only takes 4 EVs, and then after that, every other additional point in a stat requires 8 EVs. This is where a lot of people can end up losing optimization on their spreads, because they don't exactly realize how this part of it works. It's very common to waste 4 EVs here and there. This right here, the bump and the boost point, well, bump or boost point, depending on what you want to call it, is something I found a lot of people don't know, including people that do highly specific EV spreads. Especially the bump point is, there is a certain point when EVing a Pokemon where for your 8 EV investment, you'll end up getting 2 points instead of 1. It only occurs in a stat that you are boosting via nature, so like the example on here says, if you're Jolly, then you can receive a bump in the speed stat only. It only occurs in that stat. A good example of this is with Rillaboom. If you give it an adamant nature and you give it 188 EV points, it has a 185 attack stat. But if you give it 196 with adamant, it jumps up to 187. So for those 8 EV points, you're getting 2 bonus attack stats compared to the 1 that you'd normally get. This bump or boost I find very useful to hit when you aren't going max in a stat, just because it is giving you an extra overall stat point. So it's just a nice way to gauge and make use of your EVs in the most optimal way. Now, as far as EVing for grassy terrain, leftovers, and leech seed, each of these mechanics heal for 1/16 for your total health. So to maximize how much health you get back, you want your HP stat to be on a multiple of 16. As Pokemon will always round down, so at an HP stat of 160, you will get a 10 HP recovery. As where at 159 HP, you will only get a net recovery of 9.9 HP, which will then round down to 9 HP recovered from your terrain or leftovers or leech seed. Teams with Rillaboom or Mon with leftovers, you want that Pokemon's HP stat to be a multiple of 16, so that you're maximizing how much HP you're recovering each turn. If you aren't using a Mon with leftovers or you don't have a Rillaboom on your team, it's really not that necessary to go ahead and calculate for this with spreads. It's just something nice to keep in mind at the end while you're cleaning up spreads. If you have EV points left here or there, that could bump you into that 16th slot. Now, as far as Sandstorm and Hail, it's pretty much the exact opposite of grassy terrain. They're chipping you for 1/16 your total health at the end of each turn. To minimize this, you basically just want your HP stat to be a multiple of 16 minus 1. This allows you to take one less HP chip per turn. So at 160, you'd be taking 10, as where at 159, you'd only be taking 9. This is really only need to be worried about in formats where Tyranitar is everywhere, or in a max format where there's a popular rock move setting in Sandstorm. It's just another thing to keep in mind when you're doing EVs if you want to calculate for that. I really only worry about it in formats where Tyranitar is everywhere, though. Your Life Orb. So basically, Life Orb will do 1/10 of your HP back after each attack is recoil. Having HP a stat that ends in 9 will maximize your HP while lowering your Life Orb recoil. So basically, if you have 160 HP, you're going to take 16 damage, as where if you had 159, you'll only take 15 because of the way Pokemon rounding down. So it's more efficient to have a stat ending in 9 because that's going to give you the biggest amount of HP while also affecting with the rounding, so where you're going to take the least amount of damage. As far as citrus berries, they recover 1/4 of your HP when at half health. To maximize this, you just want your Pokemon's HP set to be divisible by 2 so that you reach your 50% mark while having the highest amount of HP available. This is very uncommonly called for, in all honesty, and it doesn't matter in most situations, but just as a general rule, it's going to be a whole lot better to be able to hit your citrus berry with a higher HP number than a lower one. It can factor into calculations when it comes to end games that your berry procs 1 HP stat before it normally would, which will then let you live another attack. The 1/3 berries, so your Wiki, Figgies, Aguav, and then Regenerator, recover 1/3 your HP stat. So basically, to maximize these, you're going to want to make sure your HP is divisible by 4, since it's at 1/4 for the berries that you recover 1/3. So basically, if you had an HP stat of 215, you wouldn't get your recovery until you hit 53 total HP left, as where if you had a stat of 216, you'd get it at 54. So it's a 1 point earlier proc on the berries. And for Regenerator, you get more HP back the same way that you would here. So at 115, you'd get 53 HP, as where at 216, you'd then receive 54 HP back. Substitute will always do 1/4 your HP. So to maximize your amount of substitutes, you basically want your HP stat to be a multiple of 4 plus 1. That will then allow you to have 4 substitutes and still have 1 remaining HP. Belly Drum takes half your HP when used. It's another halving one, so you want your HP stat to be divisible by 2, so that you can pop your Citrus Berry immediately at the highest HP. You also want it to be even for Snorlax and Gluttony for its 1/3 berry, so that you proc it immediately on Belly Drum. Common EVing technique that I like to use myself is the splitting of an EV, of the 8 EVs. As we stated before, it only takes 4 EV points to get an initial stat increase of 1. So by splitting 8 EVs that you'd normally put in a Pokemon into 2 separate categories, you can gain 2 additional overall stat points. So instead of going 252 in attack, you would cut it down by 8 and then invest that 8 into HP and defense instead. So that for those 8 EV points, instead of getting a plus 1 point stat in attack, you'd be getting a plus 1 point stat in HP and defense. Porygon 2 is always a very common VGC Mon with its ability download, giving it a plus 1 on entry in either attack or special attack, depending on your defensive stats. P2 will pretty much always be a special attacker now, since it's lost a lot of its good physical moves. So you pretty much want to keep it in the back of your mind to try to always have your special defense stat higher than your defensive stat. Obviously, don't go out of your way for stuff like this. It's just a nice little side note to keep in the back of your mind that when playing Porygon, you're going to want a higher special defense so that it gets that offensive boost in its attack stat and not its special attack. But that's pretty much the key examples of EVing and the smaller behind the scenes operations that you can count into your calculations, outside of your calculations.